Ever wonder what it was really like to live in the Middle Ages? Forget the fairy tales of brave knights and beautiful princesses for a moment. Let's talk about the real system that ran everything. From the king in his castle to the farmer in the field. This was feudalism, a complex web of power, land, and loyalty that shaped an entire era. And at its heart was something called the manorial system. It's cheeky with me, and we'll unravel how this system came to be, what it was like to live under it, and why it eventually faded into history. To understand feudalism, we first need to go back to one of the most influential figures of the early Middle Ages, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and later, the Holy Roman Emperor. Before him, Europe was a chaotic patchwork of warring tribes after the fall of the Roman Empire. Charlemagne was a brilliant military leader and a visionary ruler. He conquered vast territories, uniting much of Western Europe under his rule. But his legacy wasn't just about conquest. Charlemagne was a huge promoter of education and culture, sparking what's known as the Carolingian Renaissance. He standardized laws, stabilized the economy with a new currency, and strengthened his ties with the church, which gave his rule divine authority. Most importantly, he established a system of governance that laid the groundwork for feudalism. He granted land, called fiefs, to his trusted nobles in exchange for their military service and loyalty. This idea of land for service became the cornerstone of the entire medieval power structure. After Charlemagne's death, his empire fragmented, but the system he pioneered not only survived, it thrived, evolving into the full-fledged feudalism that would dominate Europe for centuries. So, how did this system actually work on the ground level? It all came down to the manor. A manor was the basic economic unit of feudal society. Think of it as a self-sufficient little world. It included a village, the surrounding fields, pastures, and forests, all controlled by a lord. This lord could be a knight, a baron, or even a bishop. He lived in the manor house or castle and was the ultimate authority in his domain. He held courtship, collected taxes, and commanded the local militia. In return for his land, granted by a higher-ranking noble or the king, he pledged his loyalty and military support. This created a pyramid of power. The king at the top, powerful nobles below him, lesser lords below them, and at the very bottom, the vast majority of the population. And who was at the bottom? The peasants, specifically the serfs. It's crucial to understand that a serf was not a slave. They couldn't be bought or sold like property. However, they weren't free either. A serf was bound to the land. They couldn't leave the manor without the lord's permission. Their life was one of hard labor and obligation. They worked the lord's personal land, the domain, for a set number of days each week. They paid taxes in the form of crops, livestock, or other goods. They even had to pay fees to use the lord's mill to grind their grain or his oven to bake their bread. Life as a serf was incredibly tough. They lived in simple, often one-room huts with their families, and sometimes even their animals. Their diet was basic, mostly consisting of bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow in their small garden plot. Meat was a rare luxury. They were vulnerable to famine, disease, and the whims of their lord, yet their life wasn't entirely without structure or community. The village and the local church were the centers of social life. Holidays and religious festivals provided a welcome break from the endless toil. It was a life of survival, deeply connected to the seasons and the land they could never leave. At the very top of this pyramid sat the feudal monarchs, kings and queens who, in theory, owned all the land in their kingdom. But here's the twist. Their power wasn't absolute. A feudal monarch's strength depended entirely on the loyalty of his powerful nobles, dukes, and earls, who controlled vast estates and armies of their own. The king granted them land, and in return they swore an oath of fealty, promising to provide knights and soldiers for the king's wars. This relationship was a constant balancing act. If a king was weak or tried to overstep his authority, his nobles might rebel, leading to civil war. To maintain control, monarchs had to be shrewd politicians, skilled warriors, and effective managers. They traveled constantly throughout their kingdom, holding court, settling disputes, and reminding everyone who was in charge. They relied on their royal council for advice and used strategic marriages to forge alliances with other kingdoms and powerful families. Power was personal and based on a fragile network of promises. A king didn't rule through a complex government bureaucracy like today. He ruled through the direct loyalty of the men who swore to follow him. This constant tension between the monarch and the nobility is a defining feature of the medieval period. So, we have this intricate system. Kings granting land to nobles, nobles controlling manors, and serfs working the land. This economic engine, manorialism, was the backbone of medieval society for hundreds of years. It provided stability in a violent age and ensured that everyone, from the lord in his castle to the peasant in the field, had a defined role. The manor was self-sufficient, producing its own food, clothing, and tools. This limited the need for long-distance trade, which had collapsed after the fall of Rome. It created a society that was rural, localized, and highly traditional. But no system lasts forever. By the late Middle Ages, feudalism and the manorial system began to decline. What happened? Several factors came into play. For one, the revival of trade and the growth of towns created a new source of wealth outside the land-based economy. A new class of merchants and artisans emerged, people whose lives weren't tied to a lord or a manor. The Crusades also played a role, exposing Europeans to new ideas and goods, further stimulating trade. Then came the Black Death in the mid-14th century. This catastrophic plague wiped out a massive portion of the population. Suddenly, labor was in short supply. Serfs, who had once been tied to the land, found themselves in a new position of power. They could demand better conditions, higher wages, or simply leave their manor for a better offer elsewhere. Lords were forced to compete for workers, and the old bonds of serfdom began to break down. The rise of more powerful, centralized monarchies with standing armies also reduced the need for the old feudal contract of knights for land. The world was changing. Money became more important than land, and the old loyalties began to dissolve. The decline of feudalism was a slow, complex process, but it paved the way for the Renaissance and the modern world we know today. It was the end of one era and the dawn of another, transforming European society forever. From the grand ambitions of Charlemagne to the daily struggles of a serf, the story of feudalism is the story of how our modern world began to take shape. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the Middle Ages. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what historical topic you'd like to explore next. See you in the next video.